Africa's 3 richest men have more wealth than the poorest 650 million people across the continent. An Oxfam equality report says billionaires Dangote, Oppenheimer and Rupert have more wealth than the poorest 50% of Africans at $28.8 billion. The study, called A Tale of Two Continents, comes on the eve of the World Economic Forum Africa meeting in Cape Town. Peter Kamalingin is with Oxfam, Pan-African Director there, and he joins us now from our Cape Town studios. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us. So, is this report just simply saying that extreme inequality across Africa is rising and efforts to fight it are not succeeding?
I lost her.
All right, so Mr. Kamalingin, I'm asking the question, this report, is it just basically saying that extreme inequality in Africa is on the rise and any efforts to fight poverty are clearly not working?
Yes, that is true. I don't think I got you clearly, but I think, could you repeat the question?
Extreme inequality in Africa on the rise and efforts to fight it not succeeding. Was this how you would summarize the report?
Absolutely, that is true. That is true that even though the continent presents very many hopes, even though the last decade has seen a lot of growth in Africa, the problem is that that growth has not been shared. As a result, there's a fear that it could actually either stagnate or even retrogress. That is true.
What do you see are the main factors behind it? Some say it's also because the international tax system is rigged against the poor, and the wealthy, these very wealthy men that we're talking about, are actually getting away with keeping hundreds of millions of US dollars out of African government revenues.
That is true. There are many reasons. One of them, of course, is exactly what you have touched on, is that, you know, the proceeds from Africa's wealth, whether it is, you know, the growth, the benefits from that growth has not been redeployed to where the most people are, where the poor people, the young people and all that are not being reinvested on that. That means the whole area of social spending on public health, on universal education, on people has not been proportionate enough to lift people out of poverty. As a result, this growth has been there, but I think it has, you know, as we were saying in the report, we have seen a boom in the continent, but that boom has been externalized. It has largely gone to a very few people, and the majority of them, many of them, of course, are in Africa, but majority of them are actually out of the continent, because in another report, as we were discussing today, although Africa at the moment contributes 2.7% of the global GDP, it paradoxically also owns 60%, 67% of the global natural resources are in this continent. So one cannot explain that. It simply means that the wealth of the country, the continent, has been externalized, which is unfortunate.
Just looking at the current debt levels, are they sustainable?
They are certainly not sustainable, because at the moment already, the two things are happening. Number one, already half of the countries in Africa are already more than 50% of the annual GDP is being spent on payment of debt. So that tells you that we are spending more money to repay debt than to reinvest on education, on healthcare, because those are the areas that suffer most often. And that is definitely not sustainable. The worst of it is that a lot of this debt has come as a result of investments like infrastructure, but unfortunately in many of the countries, the utility of that infrastructure or its inability to also raise back that revenue so that it can repay the debt has been is not happening in many of the countries. So we have also in many other cases also called for the need to do feasibility studies before these infrastructure investments are made, but most importantly also do a utility audit of the investments on agriculture, because we are beginning to see a lot of white elephants of these huge investments, and that is a double loss in itself. First, that we have foregone income that would have gone to education and health of Africa's people, but unfortunately those investments are not also yielding returns and making it more difficult.
But it's not all bad news,
just for the
is
current
it?
generation, but the generation ahead.
It's not all bad news, is it? Because you have the first ever ranking on African governments and their commitment to tackling inequality. Countries such as Namibia and Ethiopia have come up as those who ought to be lauded for their efforts in exactly what you're saying, investing in reducing inequality through education and health, for instance.
That is true. There are many of the countries that have made some progress. Unfortunately, those are still the exception rather than the norm. And I think, as you rightly mentioned, countries like Ethiopia have demonstrated quite a lot of goodwill and steps to invest on social sector, on education. Namibia is the other. Even right here in South Africa, there's a lot of progress, because at the moment, South Africans who are over 60 years, all of them get pension. And we have done studies that show that, that has actually contributed to the reduction of inequality by about 22%. The problem with South Africa, though, that it is still one of the most unequal countries in the world, because it is coming from so far, largely because of the legacy of apartheid and exclusion. So it is making progress, but given where this country is coming from, it still has a lot of ground to cover.
But looking at countries,
it is important to note that there is progress.
Looking at countries that have at least had a longer history of democracy, at least from colonial rule, I'll look at Nigeria, for instance. It says the wealthiest 5 Nigerians themselves have more than enough for ending poverty in Nigeria. So I'm looking at, if we're saying that Africa has some of the fastest developing economies in the world, the private sector, are they doing their bit to invest in social spending? Where does that money go to? Do they help towards at least raising the minimum wage, for instance?
No, actually, a lot of things, there are many things that are happening. Number one is that we have our report that shows that 75% of the individual wealth of Africa is actually stashed away in offshore, in tax havens outside the continent, where there's a very low tax rates. That means that, as I said earlier, our profits the income of these private individuals are actually externalized. That means that that's a lost opportunity for the countries. The problem, though, is that this is something, the issue of collecting tax is a responsibility of governments. The problem we have is that in many of the countries, as we see, there's actually a narrowing gap between the private sector, the corporate, and the government. So where you see what we have called state capture, it becomes very difficult for the regulator and the tax collector, that is government, to actually collect taxes from a corporate that is owned by itself as well, or individuals within it. So that becomes very difficult. That's why we have said that it's very important to make a clear distinction, so that there's clear division of roles between the tax collector and of course, the taxpayer.
All right, so final...
The fusion of the state and the corporate is a problem.
Final question, going into the WEF talks tomorrow, I believe the World Bank says by 2030, 87% of the world's poorest will be living in Africa. Do you see the inequality pattern or trends changing at all? And do you think events such as the WEF Africa can help change that?
Yeah, actually, that's the very doomsday kind of call, because all of us have been made to believe that by 2030, all of our visions of African governments are, painting a very rosy picture of we want this universal health or universal education by 2030. So 2030 is the magic year. But I think, as you rightly refer to, and as our report has said today, by 2030, if the current trends continue, it is possible, very possible now, and that's a nightmare, that 87% of the global poor will be in this continent, a continent which paradoxically is also the richest. So it is something that is worrying, but it is not insurmountable. It will take strong political will, and we have seen many countries that have made that progress. Even in many countries in Asia have made such progress. It will take political will. It is possible, but a lot of it will again go back to the basics. One, tax progressively, so that every person pays their fair share. The big corporates pay their fair share. And then secondly, reinvest that revenue into the sectors that matter most. And again, that includes education and universal health care. There's evidence that when you do that, you actually free and leverage the assets, the most important asset in any country, which is the people. It's not the gold or the minerals that we know of. That's where we need to really look at.
All right, thank you.
Tax progressively and reinvest it where it matters most.
Thank you very much, Peter Kamalingin. He is with Oxfam International. He is the Pan-African Director. And of course, a lot of those delegates at the World Economic Forum Africa will be tackling some of those issues. We'll bring you more news from that as and when it happens.